Do members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe in a Heavenly Mother, or more scandalously, Heavenly Mothers, plural? One of the most distinct teachings in the Latter-day Saint tradition compared to other Christian theologies is a robust belief in a Heavenly Mother, even if it hasn't been talked about much in the last century, which I'll get to in a bit. But what's noteworthy and important to remember when talking about how Mormons conceive of heavenly parents is that that doctrine is tied up into other distinctive doctrines that were all developed around the same time, including deification, the idea of human beings becoming godlike, and polygamy, or the men marrying several women. This topic has become a bit more relevant today due to recent comments made by Dallin H. a counselor in the LDS First Presidency and the next in line to be the prophet and president of the LDS Church. So in this video, I want to talk about both the historical origins of these distinct doctrines that are interwoven, Heavenly Mother, deification, and polygamy, and then talk about and emphasize the legacies that these doctrines and ideas still have on the Latter-day Saint tradition today. Let's dive in. As with most of Mormonism's distinctive doctrines, we need to begin with Joseph Smith, the prophet and founder of the many Mormon traditions. But what's important to know in this context is that Joseph Smith developed a inchoate theology, meaning that he gave ideas, seeds, inklings, foundations for theologies that he was never too systematic on. And when it comes to the doctrines under discussion today, Heavenly Mother, deification or theosis, and polygamy, it's important to remember that they came in the wake of the traumas experienced in Missouri, where the Mormons experienced forced expulsion from the state. There were many killed, there are many who alleged rape, and so Joseph Smith and the Mormons were searching, yearning for a doctrine that would allow them to form relationships and connections that would transcend the grave, or in the wording of Joseph Smith, creating a net of believers who are tied together through these sealing kinship networks through the eternities. Now, these rituals, all tied up in a developing temple theology, what I call in my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, the works of Abraham, start being taught in the early Nauvoo period, meaning the early 1840s. And notably, these ideas of temple sealings, people being sealed to one another in a way that transcend the grave, the idea of eternal parentage and deification and polygamy, all become interwoven. And Joseph Smith is trying to create these networks that are going to outlast any trauma, tragedy, or even death. One of my favorite books on this topic, by the way, if you're interested in it, is Samuel Brown's In Heaven as It Is on Earth, Joseph Smith and the Early Mormon Conquest of Death. Now you can see with that title of the book, Joseph Smith inverts a traditional Christian teaching found in the Bible of in earth as it is in heaven, trying to find a heavenly pattern and place it on earth. And the reverse is true with Joseph Smith's theology of the family. He's trying to create familial patterns that will then transcend the grave. And all of these ideas of temple sealings, people being bound to one another, and then polygamy, then culminate in his final few sermons, the months before he dies in 1844, that touch on the idea of deification. At the King Follett Discourse in April of 1844, and then the next month he delivers a sermon at the Grove, as it becomes known. He delivers these ideas that mankind will eventually evolve, this progressive theology, to become like a god, and the inverse being true, that God is also of the same race and species as humanity, using race in the terms as it was used back then as a genealogy or a lineage. And Lorenzo Snow, who was an apostle, would later become an LDS prophet at the end of the century. He popularizes this concept in a famous concept. As man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. We'll return to that couplet a bit later. Now, the doctrine of Heavenly Mother is a bit more complicated because we don't have anything directly from Joseph Smith on a Heavenly Mother. In fact, some scholars still debate now whether Joseph Smith taught a Heavenly Mother doctrine. The idea crops up very shortly after Joseph Smith's death. Both Eliza R. Snow, a plural wife of Joseph Smith, and William Phelps, someone who is close to Joseph Smith, both write poetry and prose within a year of Joseph Smith's death, referring to a Heavenly Mother, and both claim they got the doctrine from Joseph Smith. But there still remains some unanswered questions about the nature of that eternal parentage, especially when coupled with Joseph Smith's teachings of deification and polygamy. Notably, there's a debate over whether Joseph Smith taught something called spirit birth, meaning when humanity becomes God, do they then procreate and create spirit children for their own worlds, or do they take ownership and guidance of co-eternal spirits? Joseph Smith seems to teach more of the latter, but those who are close to him and interpret his doctrine seem to interpret it more in the former. And that idea of spirit birth is going to have broader social ramifications that go far beyond theological minutia. By the way, if you enjoy this type of historical analysis, especially the attempt to connect it to modern day issues and problems and questions, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, like these videos so it can reach more people, and share it so this discussion can continue. All right, let's get back to the history. Now, after Joseph Smith's death, all of these theologies, these ideas, continue to evolve and even escalate. And the doctrines of Heavenly Mother, polygamy, and deification go from just interweaving to becoming conjoined, where they remain part of a core theology of the family and humanity that in many ways persist all the way to the present, even though, as I'll get to, they start being downplayed. To demonstrate one of the best examples of how all these theologies collapse into one apostle, Orson Hyde, in an idea that was seconded by Brigham Young, taught that Jesus Christ, a figure in the Godhead, was not only married polygamously on his way to deification, but he had 12 wives, one from each tribe of Israel. That, to me, symbolizes how all these theologies merge together, that there has to be an evolutionary step in the eternities, that polygamy is involved, and that leads to godhood. And by the way, this theology of godhood does evolve in Mormon thought throughout the 19th century. It's not until the early 20th century and James Talmage, who maybe I'll do a video on in the future, that things like Elohim get connected to Heavenly Father and Jehovah get connected with Jesus Christ. All of those things are in transition during this era. So just these principles of Godhead are not as firmly in place as you might assume, because they become much more concrete later on. And connected to these doctrines are the theology of a Heavenly Mother, because they are tied to what the role of these plural women are going to be in the eternities. And people like Eliza R. Snow, a former plural wife of Joseph Smith, who later becomes president of the Relief Society, teaches that these gender roles that get crystallized in the present with their domestic roles, and especially their place as plural wives, is going to be elongated into the eternities. And that's a similar type of role they are going to play once they are past death, once they are resurrected from the grave. So all those theologies, Heavenly Mother, polygamy, temple sealings, and deification, all get wound together in a theology that is seen as scandalous to the rest of the nation, but provide the foundation for Mormon thought. But of course, the LDS tradition goes through a fundamental transformation at the start of the 20th century. Once they forfeit polygamy, first publicly in 1890, and then eventually, practically speaking, over the next few decades, and they start their long and uneven and inconsistent march into American assimilation, these distinctive doctrines that had previously been a proud part of what made them different start hitting a bit awkwardly and cause a lot of discomfort, as many Latter-day Saints, including leaders, are forced to address the question of, are these teachings by Joseph Smith foundational? Are they eternal? Or are they something that need to be left behind? Polygamy, of course, being one of the most prominent examples of this, that Even though Latter-day Saints gave up the practice of polygamy in this life, the doctrine of polygamy remained, with men being able to be sealed to multiple women at once, and that those sealings would be in place in the eternities. But even if that doctrine remained, the discomfort also grew, both because Latter-day Saints wanted to emphasize their commonalities with America, but they also wanted to emphasize their distance from the growing fundamentalist movement in America. That more mainstream LDS tradition is often built in response to the fundamentalists. But because Doctrine and Covenants 132, Joseph Smith's revelation on polygamy, was still part of the scriptural canon, it meant that polygamy remained a live option, but something that wasn't preached about a lot from the pulpit, but remained something that was a big part of the Latter-day Saint experience. There's also discomfort with deification, the idea of becoming like God, because that was a doctrine that previously the saints were proud of. They would preach from the pulpit all the time, the divine potential of humanity. But now it is seen as something that makes Mormons a bit distinct, a bit weird, a bit cult-like in the public imagination. So they downplay that and they start speaking of heaven in terms of a domestic family rather than eternal godhood. One of the earliest examples of this discomfort was when B. H. Roberts, a church authority and historian, was publishing his History of the Church and History of Joseph Smith. And the church removed the portion that included Joseph Smith's King Follett discourse. Remember the discourse I mentioned earlier where he talked about God being like man. And then later on in the 1990s, you get the full expression of this discomfort when Gordon B. Hinckley does a series of media interviews with Time Magazine, with Larry King, with 60 Minutes, and in each of those he tries to downplay it. To Time Magazine, when he was asked about man becoming like God, he says, I don't know if we really emphasize it, and I don't know we know a lot about it. It's more like a wishful idea or an ideal. Or to the San Francisco Chronicle, Gordon B. Hinckley, when asked about the Lorenzo Snow couplet, remember I mentioned earlier, as man as God once was, as God as man become, he said, well, that's more of a couplet more than anything, and we don't know much about it. Similar discomfort is found around the idea of Heavenly Mother. Now, there had been a rich and robust tradition of Mormon speculation on the Heavenly Mother for the first century. But after that, in the last century, Latter-day Saints are a lot more squeamish to talk about it, in part due to Mormons trying to fit into with mainstream American society that did not sacralize a divine feminine. And so these ideas and doctrines of a Heavenly Mother did not fit with the modern conceptions of gender roles, even though the silence often embodied it in itself. So it was a distinctive doctrine that placed distance between Latter-day Saints and mainstream Christianity, which meant they downplayed it, even disciplining those who wrote and researched about Heavenly Mother in the 1980s and 1990s, the very moment when Latter-day Saints are trying to work with evangelicals to form the religious right. Which now brings us to the Dallin H. Oaks quote. At a regional conference for the church in Belgium just a couple weeks ago, Dallin H. Oaks, speaking through an interpreter, gave it seems like a slip of the verbiage to show that it's something that's not talked about a lot in public, which is why it's getting a lot of attention, but it remains a live possibility, an idea. It's something on his mind. That's why it's something that can come out. Now, I'm going to play the full minute video, so you're going to have to bear with it, but I want you to understand it in the full context of those remarks. And I also want you to note the logic of how he's explaining the necessity of there having to be heavenly parents due to the presence of lived parents. And then after the video, I'll dissect it a bit more and I'll connect it to Dallin Oaks' own lived reality. All right, here is Dallin H. Oaks.
For reasons the Lord has not revealed, we do not know much about a heavenly mother.
Voor redenen die nog niet zijn geopenbaard tot ons, weten we niet veel over een hemelse moeder.
But we have been told that the purpose of life on earth is to give us the opportunity to grow toward being like our Heavenly Father.
Maar de reden dat het ons is verteld is de reden om te leven is zoals te worden zoals onze hemelse Vader.
And we know that we are children of heavenly parents.
En we weten dat we kinderen zijn van hemelse ouders.
So we know that we have a heavenly mother or mothers.
En we weten dat we een hemelse moeder hebben of moeders.
But for reasons the Lord has not revealed, we do not know much about our Heavenly Mother.
Maar voor een reden dat nog niet is geopenbaard, weten we niet veel van de hemelse moeder.
But we know we must have one because both men and women are working for exaltation.
I hope you saw a few points there that make more sense now that you know the broader history. First, no, it's not something that's being boldly proclaimed like many LDS doctrines. It's something that's a logical conclusion or extension of LDS theology without being an emphasis. Note the lack of clarity. He emphasizes we don't know much, that God hasn't revealed a lot of it. But also see how he is expanding from his own lived experience. Now, it is important to emphasize the lived experience for Dallin H because polygamy is a live reality for him. He was married to a woman named June Dixon with whom he had his children up until 1998 when she passed away. A couple of years later, when he started dating Kristen McMain, according to his biography, which was published by a church historian, Richard Turley, a few years ago, we get this anecdote from Oakes's own diaries, which is when he was dating his soon-to-be second wife, he explicitly asked her, "Are you okay with being a second wife in the eternities?" In other words, acknowledging the polygamous nature of their unions. So now he is sealed to a woman who, in her mind and in his mind, her only role in the eternities is bound both to the idea of polygamy as well as the idea of deification. This idea of them becoming godlike, having their own children, and becoming a part of a godhood, which, as I'll talk about, has these complications and implications of spirit birth. So here you see, in 2025, these theologies of Heavenly Mother, deification, and polygamy still all bound together. I mentioned earlier the mainstream LDS discomfort with some of these distinctive doctrines and why that's the case, but I think it's also important to note why some more progressive members of the Mormon tradition are similarly uncomfortable with the idea of Heavenly Mother, not to mention, of course, polygamy. And that's because this idea of the way Heavenly Mother has now been constructed within the LDS tradition seems to reaffirm both a subservient status of women, because we don't talk about her, she doesn't take a central role. The LDS discourse is that she's too sacred to discuss, but LDS talk about lots of sacred things. And further, it seems to, when you get into this doctrine of spirit birth, it also causes a lot of complications. Because as many Latter-day Saints have taught over the years, and it seems to be implied by some of the teachings of eternal procreation, if you interpret Joe Smith in a way to say that the role of a Heavenly Mother or mothers in the eternity is to produce spirit children, that means you are consigning women in the eternities to consistently, perpetually just giving birth. Right? That's an extension of a lived reality that many women see as confining of what their eternal possibilities could be. And this is even setting aside the whole notion that scholars have pointed out, especially feminists and queer scholars lately, that the idea of Heavenly Mother is going to perpetuate and extend ideas of heteronormity that or heteronormativity that people are hoping to transcend in the next life. So there you have it. I hope all of this made sense. If I missed anything, please make sure to leave a comment. I think this shows how history is necessary to understand these ideas that sometimes crop up, show the long historical trajectory that brought us to this point, and the different contexts that have shaped these ideas. If you found the video useful, please make sure to hit the like button and share with friends so this discussion can continue. History has never been more relevant than it is today because of these very types of matters, which is why I think it's important for us to research, discuss, and present them so that we can add context to otherwise befuddling moments.